What in your workshop is a motivation killer? Is it remembering to pick up your kids from school, or is it realizing you haven't done your taxes yet? I believe the number one motivation killer in a workshop is not having what you need on hand. In this video, I will show you 5 items that everyone should have on hand in their workshop. This will be entirely my opinion, and it may vary depending on the types of projects you do and the space you have and your budget. The first item on the list is material. Shocker, I know. In my workshop, I mainly use metal and wood to build my projects. Other people might use different materials such as plastics, ceramics, or rubber. Now, I have 3 main places where I store my materials. The first place I store my materials under my wooden workbench. As you can see, it is mainly short pieces of wood. Some of you might think that these pieces of wood look too small for any project, but I disagree. I would argue this is my most valuable material storage. Think of it like this. If you only need a small piece of wood, do you really want to cut up the big pieces you could use for something else, or go all the way to store for such a small piece? To me, a collection of small offcuts is actually more valuable than the bigger pieces. As you can see, most of these pieces are pressure-treated construction lumber. I used to work at Home Depot, so I would often buy the on-sale pieces of wood on the scrap cart. On my other workbench is my small metal storage, but I try to keep this more organized. On hand, I keep pipe, bar, angle, and square tube. Now, it might seem wasteful to keep material on hand in such a small workshop, and you might be tempted to store it somewhere else, or in something like a bucket. But in my opinion, being able to physically see what material you have to work with saves you so much more time and prevents you from buying stuff you already have. That's one of the reasons why I have all of these small pieces. I used to keep all of my scraps in a bucket and in my shed. You know the saying, out of sight, out of mind. I would always forget that I have it and end up buying more. And the few times that I do remember, I'm never motivated enough to dig through the bucket and find what I need. Another area I store materials is under my miter saw. On these shelves, I store medium lengths of wood and metal. On the upper shelf is wood, and on the lower shelf is aluminum, steel, and composite decking. I built a bridge across my ditch to my mailbox a couple of years ago, and I like to keep some spare pieces on hand in case a branch falls on the bridge and damages it. These pieces get used less frequently than the small pieces, but they're nice to have when I need them. In my workshop, there is a progression of materials. The bigger the piece, the less readily available and visible they are. I keep the big stuff in the shed because it's easy to keep track of, the medium pieces under the miter saw, so I have them on hand still, and the small pieces easily accessible. It also helps me to keep my small pieces organized. If the small stock is always visible, I tend to keep it clean because I like a neat workshop. Now, having materials is good and all, but you can't do anything with them without fastening them together. Screws, nails, nuts, and bolts are extremely helpful to have on hand in a workshop. Having hardware in the workshop has saved me a trip to the store so many times that I've lost count. It's always so frustrating being in the middle of a project only to have to stop what you're doing, run down to the hardware store, find what you're looking for, come back to the workshop, and continue off. In comparison, if you already have the hardware, it'll take you maybe 10 seconds to open a drawer, grab what you need, and continue the project. One tip I would give when accruing a hardware collection is to buy the container with a little more than what you need. For example, when I go to the store to buy screws, I tend to buy the 1-pound boxes even if I only need a few screws. Nuts and bolts share a similar philosophy. Now, why don't I recommend one of those all-in-one hardware sets you see on Amazon? Someone might be really tempted to buy that 400-piece kit. I don't recommend them because most of the kits is either hardware you will rarely use or just filler. That 400-piece kit likely has 300 of its pieces just nuts and washers. That leaves you with only a couple screws and bolts left to use, most of which are too small to use in many projects. The hardware I currently have on hand are some drywall screws, various lengths of deck screws, some stainless steel screws, hook screws, and self-tapping screws. The next item that should always be on hand in the workshop is driver bits. It's the most annoying thing in the world when you need to drive one more screw, only to realize you stripped out your last driver bit. Any cheap driver bit kit will do, but I recommend this DeWalt one. It has the bits most people use, and spares are the most common. I also recommend getting a set of your most common bits. This Craftsman 15-piece No. 2 Phillips head is great, but it's just a personal preference. In extension, having more driver bits is to also have drill bits too. Having multiple drill bits is handy in more ways than one. On one hand, there are spares in case you break some, and on the other hand, they're great to modify or sacrifice. I often sacrifice some when I know I'll be drilling into something problematic like stainless steel. I recommend buying a nice set, and also buying a cheap set like ones at Harbor Freight. Another item in the workshop to have on hand is adhesives. Adhesives range from superglue to wood glue to epoxy. In my workshop, I tend to use more wood glue, though ironically I just ran out. Glues are amazing to have around and go well in conjunction with screws and bolts, though truth be told, I don't recommend stocking up too much. Many glues and adhesives have an expiration date. Epoxy can last a couple years, wood glue can last a year or two, and superglue might already be expired on the shelf, so definitely check the expiration date on them before you buy them. One way to make your adhesives last longer is to put them in your freezer or refrigerator. Wood glues last much longer when they are cold, and epoxy's shelf life is almost indefinite when they are frozen. There are some nice haves in the workshop that aren't strictly necessary. A couple honorable mentions go to hooks for hanging finished items or painting, brackets for attaching bits of wood together, and rust remover for fixing up old tools. One last item that everyone should have on hand is sandpaper. Sandpaper is one of the most used consumables in my projects. I use them for sanding off rust, breaking corners of our work pieces, and sanding finished pieces. Sandpaper come in various grits and sizes. Most of my sandpaper is sized for my belt sander or random orbit sander. On a normal basis, I typically stock 6 grit sandpaper through 220 grit. Obviously, if you're sanding something like a car, you will need much higher grit than this, but this is the range for most general use. If you are starting out and you don't want to invest heavily in good quality tools yet, I highly recommend getting good quality sandpaper. Having a cheap sander and good sandpaper is vastly superior than having a good sander and bad sandpaper. Sanding is already tedious and slow, don't make it more frustrating than it needs to be. Running out of a certain item in your workshop mid-project can be a real motivation killer. Now it's going to take some time for you to crew as much stuff as I have, so take your time and build things as you collect more. You will never know what you need unless you start building. I hope my video has given you some ideas on how to reduce wasted time and make your workshop more efficient. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.